everyone. Welcome to CRWS. We are concluding our study on the psychopathic racial personality and other essays by Dr. Bobby E. Wright. The final chapter being The Black Child, a Destiny in Jeopardy. The date is March 12th, and white people are still in charge. Getting The Black Child, a Destiny in Jeopardy. And if we observe the current state of black people in 2025, we will say that we can see that this title is still very, very accurate. And if you think about Dr. Frances Welsing's book, how black people in general are in a crisis, she has a chapter about us being in a crisis as well. Very little has changed. In fact, things have gotten much, much worse for people classified as black due to our failure to understand and counter and codify around and against the system of racism, white supremacy. And I'm just gonna get started by reading the very first page of this chapter. It is page 31 for folks who have the actual book. He says, Dr. Bobby Wright says, one of the most tragic beliefs widely shared by blacks throughout the world is that white-controlled educational institutions, regardless of whether they are elementary schools or universities, will educate our children. Faith continues to prevail in spite of overwhelming evidence which disputes this belief. Blacks continue to ignore the irrefutable truth that in a racist social system, all institutions will reflect, protect, and sustain values that are consistent with racism. This should not be considered surprising or profound, since all institutions serve to perpetuate the social theory of the group which created them. Therefore, any social system established by whites, the institutions will reflect racism. Likewise, white established institutions in black-controlled countries will continue to protect the welfare of whites, even after whites ostensibly leave. So he's reminding us, and further giving examples of institutions, any institutions, whether it's hospitals, churches, schools, banks. All these institutions are designed to help the people who establish them, which are white people. And that is something we have to truly understand. We as a people classified as black, victims of racism, constantly think that we can, buy our way, get enough money out of the system of white supremacy, or pray our way out of the system via some sort of religions or church, or educate ourselves out of the system of white supremacy. None of this is possible because all of these institutions at the end of the day are controlled by white people, and their goal is to sustain, maintain, and refine the system of white supremacy. He gives up, throughout this text, he has given us a bunch of examples of menticide, how our thinking capabilities and our will has totally been sabotaged by racist men and racist women, white supremacists who classify themselves as white, and how we continue making the same mistakes over and over. He gives this tragic example here over something that happened in Zimbabwe. He says here on the same page, for example, blacks in Zimbabwe accepted a constitution which gave a 4% white minority control of the judicial, military, and economic institutions in return for their agreeing to stay in the country. They also accepted as a leader of the whites the former prime minister of the country, Ian Smith, who is responsible for tens of thousands of black deaths and indescribable black suffering. So this just
When I read this, I thought about Jim Jones, another white psychopath who black people trusted and met their demise because of it. Because we are so confused, because we have been brutally, um, I want to say violated. That's the first word that came to mind. Brutally violated. We have developed this like Stockholm syndrome where we trust, and I would say, from observations, evidence shows that we actually worship these people who have been warring against us for hundreds of years. At the minimum, hundreds of years they've been waging wars against us, and that's all I have from. That's all I want to share for now. I'm gonna pause and see if other folks from the cohort would like to share. Miss Action or Miss Ash.
One of the quotes that I found interesting, page 32, where he mentions, where do I start? Okay. Therefore, in any social system established by whites, the institutions will reflect racism, and even white established institutions in black controlled, in quotes, countries will continue to protect the welfare of whites even after the whites ostensibly leave. And then it kind of picks up further. Uh, he kind of circles back to it in a way, I guess, on page 35. It should be clear that Black independent schools can exist by themselves, but will be limited in what they can accomplish as long as there is an absence of other Black institutions. For example, economic, military, religious, etc. Further, neither can exist in a vacuum. Their values and purposes must be consistent with the ideals that are contained in a social theory. So basically, the system of racism, white supremacy, has made it so that every aspect of life supports the system. So if you're trying to counter it, you can't do it without a system of your own, I would guess. That's kind of what I gathered from these two quotes.
One thing I also found significant was Bobby Wright's his explanation and understanding of racism and white supremacy. He um, mentions Dr. Francis Cress Welsing and Neely Fuller Jr., which is super constructive. You know, to have black scholars and fellow victims of racism who, you know, are able to use each other's theories and definitions to bring further understanding to what we are actually dealing with. Just to share this definition and his explanation of racism and white supremacy, he goes and says here on page 32. In the ISIS papers by Dr. Francis Welsing, Fuller goes further to develop the concept that racism is not merely a pattern of individual and or institutional practice, but is indeed a universally operating system of white supremacy rule and domination. People participate. He discounts as invalid theories which state that the evolution of economic systems has necessitated or produced this state of affairs. Instead, he turns such theories upside down by suggesting that various economic systems such as capitalism, communism, and socialism have been devised, used, and refined in the effort to achieve the primal goal of white domination. In other words, the goal of the system of white supremacy is not for anything other than the establishment, maintenance, expansion, and refinement of world domination by members of the group which classifies itself as the white race.
You know, like a lot of people still to this day think that socialism can help, can help with racism, help fight racism. Communism can help fight racism, and these concepts have been used to just destroy large numbers of non-white people. We had the Vietnam War, which white people said they were fighting against communism, which in fact they were actually just dropping bombs on people they classified as yellow, or they have historically called yellow people, aka non-white people. So all of these concepts, we have to understand that most isms, colorism, socialism, communism, totalitarianism, all these isms lead back to the root cause of all world's problems, which is racism, white supremacy. And he asked a really important and answers a really important question on the same page 32. With educating the black child. He has in all caps his answer. Everything. Education is a political dynamic, and for a people who have no social theory, reading, writing, and arithmetic should be less important than what is written and read. Therefore, in order to liberate the minds of black children, a black social theory must be developed. And we mentioned before throughout these discussions that we already have a social theory that we can implement and practice, and that is Neely Fuller Jr.'s United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept, a book for victims of racism, white supremacy. That book can give us the culture meaning simply what we do, what people do, a new culture of behaving that will allow us to codify ourselves and counter the system of racism, white supremacy. It allows us to not fall into the same traps as we have been doing. Where we try to unite against racism, we have to be our own individuals, selves, and we unite with a code, the same as how white people have a code of racism, which they unite around and practice worldwide. Neely Fuller has produced a code that can counter it if a effective number of people attempt to do so. We already have the social theory. We just need an effective number of non-white people worldwide to practice this theory of codifying themselves against racism, white supremacy. And I'm going to continue reading on page 33. He shares the importance of a social theory. A social theory determines the destiny of a people by establishing guidelines of life. It defines their relationship with other living things. It defines values and rituals, methods of re-education, how enemies are to be dealt with, etc. The ultimate achievement of black social theory would be the recreation of black culture. The eminent black scientist, Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, succinctly placed culture in its proper perspective by stating the following. I consider culture as a rampart which protects a people, collectively. Culture must, above all, play a protective role. It must ensure the cohesion of the group. Following this line of thinking, the vital function of a body of African human science is to develop the science of collective belonging through a reinforcement of culture. This can be done by developing the linguistic factors, by establishing the historical consciousness of African and black people so as to arrive at a common feeling of belonging to the same culture and historical past. Once this is attained, it will become difficult to divide and rule and oppose African communities to oppose African communities one against the other. If we unite around the understanding that we are all worldwide slaves, victims, subject to the system of white supremacy, we will eliminate comparing ourselves to one another. We we should and would eliminate, the name calling and the conflict we produce with one another, because unifular code gives us a new way to exist while subjected to the system of white supremacy, minimizing conflict, avoiding conflict with other non-white, especially black people. No more name calling, no more harming fellow black people, no more lying to ourselves, pretending that we are things that we are not. We are not strong men and women. We are victims, captured people, prisoners of war. We would understand that racism is a war against us, and we have been captured before we were even born. Having these all known to us collectively worldwide will surely correct and improve how we interact with one another. We would improve, hopefully eliminate the tacky, trashy, and terroristic culture that white people have given us. The street culture, the ghetto culture, the slang nonsense, and the poor way we have been trained to exist on this planet can be corrected by simply give us our historical past and a destiny, a future worth existing for. Because currently I just saw a show, a trailer to a show last night. Don't remember the name of it, but it's something I've joked about before. It's a futuristic show, like in the future, and the trailer depicted a bunch of black females somewhere far in the future, still acting very ghetto, tacky, and trashy, calling each other bees and whatnot. There's something like, oh, okay, so another mockery, because this is how they would prefer it. They prefer us to be 200 years in the future, still practicing worthless culture. And what's worthless culture? Anything that is not helping us to solve our problems, which a lot of the things that we do as people classified as black, as non-white people in general, do not get us closer to solving any problems. And we have to act like child, but in the system of race and white supremacy, all black people are considered children while subjected to the system of white supremacy. So if we want to actually create a better so-called life for our offspring, the people we think are our children, we have to actually educate them on what is going on planet Earth, so they can grow up and avoid, so they can attempt to avoid the many, many mistakes that we fell into, because no one told us, no one knew to tell us about the system of racism, white supremacy. So, should I? Okay, so
Oh, I wanted to say something.
please do.
Um, okay, in the text, when the part you just read about emphasizing social theory over necessarily, where he was saying emphasizing what you read, not just the act of reading, which I think that's a really, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a very interesting and useful passage, especially when it comes to like attempting to rear offspring, because it is really important to have a foundational social theory or foundational analysis of the system of racism, white supremacy, because it helps you to just be able to navigate and make decisions, and also gives you perspective. And I think it is something that, no matter kind of what your financial or time position, you can try to implement when you're rearing offspring, because I know for me, like that would have been very helpful, especially in my younger years when I was kind of in an environment where I didn't really understand white people, and I was for
put into an environment where they were all around me. And I think that I didn't understand that it was in that point in my life, my job to analyze, understand them, and in the context of white supremacy. And instead, I felt like really confused. And I also think having a strong social theory helps, or an analysis of white supremacy when you're very young, helps to not feel like, helps when you're trying to navigate conflict with non-white people. I know I felt times like I was in competition with other non-white people, and that's really just, fighting for scraps that white people give you. It's not actually, you're not actually in any sort of competition, and if you are, it's just competing for white people's favor, which is not something that anyone who has integrity or who's interested in justice would do. So I just thought really, I don't know, when I heard that, I thought it was really important because, a lot of, because of the position that certain Black people are in, they may not have the time, and some of them may not have the ability to teach a lot of the children that what they are supposed to be learning in school. But you can really supplement a lot of that with a good social theory, a good understanding of racism, so that when they're reading about the so-called American Revolution, or when they're reading about even like the history of like scientific discoveries, etc., they'll have an understanding of, African history. They'll have an understanding of racism to be able to put into context. Okay, why am I learning this? Why is the teacher giving me this information? And what are the other sources that I've already learned, so that I can actually put this information in the correct context?
Precisely. If black parents, so-called black parents, had invested like a fraction of the amount of time they did, like making sure their children could read all the Harry Potter books, and invested that energy into like, yeah, let's read some Dr. Francis Chris Wilson, so Almason Wilson. Surely we'd have like a much more understanding of what we're dealing with, but that is not the case. Some black people do a lot of reading, but they are reading absolute garbage. So reading important things is certainly important.
He says here, page 33, Black children can be educated only after Blacks develop a philosophy of education, which must be contained in a Black social theory. There's no alternative to this dictum, and without it, even Black independent schools will fail to reach their full potential. It should be clear that Black independent schools can exist by themselves, but will be limited in what they can accomplish as long as there is an absence of other Black institutions, e.g., economic, military, religious. Furthermore, neither can exist in a vacuum. Their values and purposes must be consistent with the ideas that are contained in a social theory.
Yeah, I don't see until an effective number of Black people actually understand what we're dealing with and develop the will to counter racism and white supremacy, we shouldn't be expected to have any of these institutions operable. This is why it takes an united, independent front to solve this problem, to get some sort of momentum going before we can even attempt to establish these institutions without some sort of sabotage taking place. Because we've attempted to do these things before, and what happens? They get infiltrated and sabotaged by racist men and racist women, because we have failed to understand what we are truly dealing with, a enemy that is unrelenting and truly a master of deception and violence. And we have a long track record of Black people they've killed horrifically to illustrate that fact. I'm going to continue. On page 34, he says here, actually, Oh yeah, this is very when I read this, I was like, wow, this is very, very true. Unfortunately, he says but one of the most valid methods of evaluating the condition or status of a people is to examine the process of their child rearing practices. The black child today, whether in the United States, Africa, South America, etc., stands as a tragic example of a powerless, directionless people. Throughout the animal kingdom, there's generally an inviolate law which dictates the young are to be protected at all costs. Yet in black communities, not only are children not protected, but in too many cases are offered as sacrificial lambs to a devouring enemy. And what are examples of this? This is just, black, so-called black parents being totally uninvolved in their child's K through 12 so-called educational, you know, career. They don't know exactly what the child is learning. They don't ask enough questions about what the child is learning, and they may ask, do you have any homework? Go get your homework done, but they are super uninvolved in their child's educational career. And I know, my victim mother, she made sure I could read, and maybe sometimes asked me if I did my homework. She just assumed that I was doing and learning the correct things. But, she was a victim of racism. She does not know a fraction of what I know about the system of white supremacy, which is very, very tragic. But that is how this system is designed. Black people in general are not supposed to know what's going on planet Earth. We are meant to be utterly confused so we can continue being slaves and we can continue producing babies who will exist into slaves and won't know as much as possibly less than what we know, which is very, very tragic. But we send our children to these schools, and we literally expect and trust schools to actually teach our offspring what we think are our children. And that's just tragic, because history shows that enemies don't teach their enemies. They dominate them. They teach them to maybe certain skills so they're able to be better slaves, but they don't teach them to solve problems for themselves. They teach them to solve problems for their rulers, yes, not how to solve problems that are going to actually benefit them and their families and so-called communities, which in this current state of 2025, black people are not allowed to have families or communities, but because these things need to be protected in order for them to exist, and these things need to be constructive in order for them to exist. And unfortunately, none of these things are constructive for black people to be a part of, like families, communities. These things have not served black people in a way that has helped us to solve these problems, unfortunately. So we cannot correctly say we have these things. He goes on to say, he's mentioned in the last chapter as well, but just how just ever since desegregation, which should never have happened, because we lost most of our black staff and black school teachers and black principals. All were wiped out in the span of a few signatures being signed, putting in place desegregation. And he says, and then just this chapter just truly depicts the mental side, just how much white people have gotten us to have zero trust in our own intellectual abilities, and just to have zero faith in our abilities to do anything of constructive values. It says here on page 35, black leaders and parents are so obsessed with the concept of the closer we get to whites, the whiter we will get syndrome, that they are willing to pay any price, including the destruction of our children's minds. They totally ignore the fact that since 1954 we have completely lost all control, regardless of how minimal over our children's education. In the South, under the guise of integration, thousands of black teachers and administrators of formerly all black schools were replaced with whites and are now unemployed. In Chicago, the black leadership accepted a plan whereby the teaching and administrative force would remain 65% white and 35% other. In other words, throughout this nation, when blacks speak of integrating schools, they do not show any concern over who teaches their children. In fact, blacks take general position of, we don't care what color our teachers are as long as they are qualified. Yet, if black parents were asked what are the qualifications for teaching, they cannot tell you. However, this behavioral attitude of most black educators is even more tragic. However, the behavioral attitude of most black educators is even more tragic, even as those educators observe and experience their own personal economic destruction and the destruction of the minds of their children. They still exert the virtues of integrated education. So that's just very, very tragic, but this is what has been done to our minds over hundreds of years of being tortured, killed, maimed, and abused by racist man and racist woman, aka white people who believe and practice racism. So this is unfortunately to be expected, but this is stuff that needs to be addressed, and we should be very much aware of when we just see just the reality of black children being placed in all these schools where they learn absolutely nothing of value when it comes to how to solve problems. They may know how to solve a couple of math problems, may learn how to put a couple of sentences together if they are lucky, but understanding the long history of violence against them by white people, that is not being taught in the schools, and if it is, it's being taught in a very convoluted way that does nothing but destroy the self-esteem of black people, of black children, I should say. And he has here, he mentioned.
I think
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, I was gonna add to your point that I think too, when because of how black people are trained to have a lot less patience for other black people, I think that it's really incumbent on people that are trying to help the youth, black youth, um, to exercise a lot of patience, because I think that a lot of black children are really traumatized by parents or attempted parents trying to teach them and being really impatient and almost traumatizing them or screaming at them when they're trying to learn information, because the parent is, or the attempted parent is not well versed in how to relay the information to the child in the way that they'll understand it. So I just wanted to bring that up too, that it's really important to have patience with black children when you're teaching them information, and don't assume that. I think there's an assumption that they're just not listening, or they're just not paying attention, or they don't care, when really it's more likely that the information is not being presented in a proper manner. That's all I want to say.
Oh, yep, that's totally key. That's something we learned about in the last chapter, educating the black child, and how some black children just need to be taught, just need to be given information in a totally different way, which these schools simply do not do for them. So that's absolutely the case as well. He mentions another great black scholar, Dr. Chancellor Williams, on page 35. He says here. Dr. Chancellor Williams, in his incomparable book, The Destruction of the Black Civilization, thoroughly analyzes the black educators. Those Negroes who are so frantically fighting to escape the African race by way of integration and amalgamation will continue to meet everlasting and universal opposition from the whites. The Negro drive to be with whites in every situation is equaled by the determination to prevent it. Yet the whites must truly feel a sense of pride in seeing this Negro leadership so clearly validating their own beliefs in white superiority. Their pretended quality education objective actually collapses under the wheels of busing for racial balance. They are proclaiming to all the world that regardless of general desegregation in any, all, or predominantly black population, the blacks themselves are utterly incapable of achieving or maintaining high standards of excellence in education or indeed anything else. Here we have within the race the intolerable situation of an anti-black group proclaiming the race's inherent inferiority more effectively than the whites ever could, precisely because this group is regarded as black. So it used to be, after slavery, black schools, they didn't have the same resources as white schools, obviously, but there was not this thought that the teachers were inadequate, the students weren't learning anything. They still had the will to make sure with the poor resources, the children are still learning things of value. Very, very tragic, but that's how racism has been orchestrated, and this has all been arranged. And white people, they enjoy this reality. And he says, back to Bobby, he writes on words, and like what he's suggesting, and but this should be all of our goal. I would say, he says, clearly I am not suggesting that whites are omnipotent. On the contrary, history tells us they will be had. However, it will not be done by blacks engaging in mythology, denial, or escapism, etc., but only by our actively and consciously participating in the destruction of racism, which means the destruction of white civilization. We must accept the indisputable fact that racism and Western civilization are synonymous events, and as the song says, you can't have one without the other. This so-called civilization is pure, putrid, vile culture conducted by all people of the planet. It has been reduced, and it's best described as pitiful. I would add vile. The things we have normalized, just the accumulation of trash we call landfills, just how we laugh at violence, how we have been taught that killing is fun and just civilization is not what it should be, and it needs to be totally replaced with a civilization that puts people first, a civilization that practices this concept we've been attempting to bring to planet Earth, called justice, guaranteeing no one is allowed to be mistreated, and the people who need help the most receive constructive help. This needs to be established. That should be a definition of civilization. No one being harmed. People on the planet are allowed to thrive and survive and not be super miserable because we have to deal with not having enough money, not having enough food, not having enough shelter. All these things we shouldn't have to worry about these things, but because we live in a system of white supremacy, we must be miserable, especially if you're a non-white. That is the requirement for you to exist on this planet. you must be super confused and somewhat miserable, if not totally miserable, if you're classified as black on this planet. This civilization white people say they created is worthy of being obliterated. It is not something that anyone should strive to be a part of, or should feel proud for creating. This place is absolutely disgusting. We should loathe what we see when we go outside, and for them to call this a civilization. This is we are truly forced to live in like a barbaric. This is a barbaric era, if you ask me. And evidence suggests all the incorrect things allowed to happen on this planet. This is not a pleasant place, nor has it ever been since white people conquered the entire planet. And yeah, I don't think I'm in error about that. And now he goes on to like explain like the different experiences a white child and a black child receive during their educational process on the same page 36. We must be about the business of liberating the minds of black children. In order for that to occur, the minds of all blacks who interact with them must also be liberated. There's no other way. It is relatively easy to educate black children, even about their Africanity, but it is extremely difficult to reinforce the education. Therefore, even sitting in the same classroom, white children will be educated and black children will be trained. The white child will be taught how to rule, and the black child trained to be ruled. Training is defined as teaching a group what to do, teaching a group what to think rather than how to think, making them dependent rather than assisting and developing skills which could be used for independent activity, rewarding behavior that operates against the group's interests, promoting individual rather than group achievement, and instilling negative self-concepts and low self-esteem. The opposite of the above metacidal process training is the education in which the learning process becomes a liberating force. So, what we learned from the code book, Neither Food Dreamers code book, is, compensate for what is missing. Like, given the state of black people 2025, non-white people 2025, I don't expect us to be making schools anytime soon. I don't expect us to be establishing any institutions dedicated to replacing white supremacy with a system of justice. But we can compensate for our inability to do that right now. We can compensate. If we're not able to put our offspring in institutions and schools that teach them the importance of solving this race problem, we can supplement their education, like Ash brought up earlier, and like I'm gonna read here that Dr. Bobby Wright suggests. Black parents whose children are not in independent schools should at a minimum expose them to a well-structured supplemental black educational program. Some of the most dangerous blacks in the world are many of those brothers and sisters who finish graduate school with honors, yet operate against the interests of blacks because of their Eurocentric orientation. The writer does not mean to imply that blacks should not attempt to achieve high levels of training in white institutions, but should be aware that it's not education they are receiving. Furthermore, there is no attempt to glamorize the street mentality that is so prevalent in the black community today, and which is creating widespread destruction. One of the most prevalent metacidal myths in the black community is that street sense is positive. What is really being inferred is that whites do not control the streets in the black community, nor the behavior of blacks on those streets. This is untrue. whites have more control, or at least as much control over brothers and sisters in the streets than those in universities. Street sense generally prepares blacks to deal with one another in very destructive ways, and then the whites wipe out the winner. The population of prisons, drug programs, and funeral homes verify this reality. So for a long time, people would brag about being street smart, whatnot, being able to survive in the hood is very very important to be able to survive anywhere. But when when street culture in this day and age is still rampant, we have thousands, I don't know if I should say thousands, but hundreds of black children, black males, black females having fun, pretending to be gangbangers, scheming on one another, causing great harm to one another, all for whites to benefit from all of this destruction and misery. All of this needs to end, and black people certainly need to stop glamorizing it. But we have been taught that when we glamorize it, we are able to get more comfort, which is why rap is so popular. It's a truly destructive force amongst black people, but white people understand this, which is why it's so commodifiable. But we have to teach our youth the truth about what is going on, or else we will continue to be just the biggest losers on planet Earth. When I say losers, I mean just losing this war on all fronts. At home, in the schools, on the streets, in the universities, just a totally lost people is what we are right now. And so that was all of my notes on this chapter, the final chapter, the concluding study of this text. All very significant information. I would suggest folks definitely read this book, because we weren't able to cover everything, but definitely tried to cover as much as I could. But a truly fascinating text. Super tragic. Dr. Bobby Wright was not able to live a long life because he certainly had the will and ability to help a endless amount of victims of racism. And I'll pause there to see what other folks would like to share their notes. But I am done sharing my notes.
There's a quote on page 38. I was hoping you'd get to it. Where is it? We must be about the business of liberating the minds of Black children, but in order for that to occur, the minds of all Blacks who interact with them must also be liberated. So I took this as, if we want to educate, teach Black children how to think, we as so-called Black adults need to know how to think and not lie to ourselves about the system that we're in, not offer up Black children to psychopaths and brain trashed individuals who basically want to victimize and subjugate all non-white people. So, yeah, that was my final thought on that.
Well put. Ms. Ash, do you have any notes to share before we conclude?
No, I don't have any additional comments.
Understood. Yeah, so the key takeaway is Black children and Black people in general need a social theory that directs us into where we are headed. Actually reminds me. Yep. I just just got one of my sticky notes that I did not go over. Page 33. Page 33. There is an African proverb which warns the traveler of life that if you don't know where you are going, then any road will get you there. Blacks throughout the world don't know where they are going and have resolved to just take any road. What does it matter? And this is detrimental to any group of people, which is why a group of people, needs to take charge of their destiny, no matter their circumstances. Just because we are currently being dominated in all areas of people activities, does not mean we cannot counter and attempt to solve this problem. We are no longer in chattel slavery. We are allowed to move about in this giant prison known as racism, white supremacy, aka planet Earth. We are allowed to move freely, somewhat think freely. So we need to practice, develop a social theory, which has already been done for us. We just need to understand the code book, the ISIS papers, Urugu. All the information has already been given to us. We just have to act on it, implement it. We do not want to be a people that have no future, because there's no future if we are still dominated by racism, white supremacy. 100 years from now, that is not a future. That's just us going deeper into hell, I would call it. Further away from the Creator, deeper into hell. Not a place you have to die to get to. It's a place you have to continue to allow to happen to you, which is racism, white supremacy. So we need to choose a road. It should be a road of justice. No more endless hordes of black people being killed, allowed to die in unjust circumstances. The road we should definitely pay for ourselves is justice, guaranteeing no one is allowed to be mistreated, and those who need constructive help receive constructive help. Get your copy of the code book from producejustice.com. Listen to some lectures by Neely Fuller Jr., Dr. Bobby Wright, Dr. Almason Wilson, Dr. Francis Quest Bosing, Dr. Mariba Ani, and Dr. Chancellor Williams, most certainly, Dr. Henry Clark. So many black people have died attempting to solve this problem. Too many black people who actually care about black people spent their entire existence trying to give us the tools to solve this problem. We as a people, classified as black, non-white, whatever, need to solve this problem, because it's just, this should not be our reality. I think everyone's done sharing, so CRWS signing out.